Hello and good morning from Ipoh. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, I'm having an amazing day. And if I'm having an amazing day, you should also be having an amazing day. Yes. Behind me is the Kinta River, which is one of the most famous rivers in Malaysia. And just down the road is my hotel. Over there, known as the Abbey by the River Hotel. It's a very, very, very good hotel, I must say. It is spacious, affordable, and extremely accessible, because everything in the CBD worth seeing, like Concubine Lane, for example, is only a stone's throw away from Abbey by the River. So I strongly recommend Abbey by the River Hotel. And no, I'm not being paid to promote them. Yes, I often come to Ipoh in the same way I often escape for weekend getaways in Malacca or Penang, because I need to get away from all the bullshit culture of Petaling Jaya. Yes, Petaling Jaya, as you know, is Chinese ultra capital. It's basically where all the most fanatical right-wing Chinese Malaysian diaspora zealots are concentrated. The people in Ipoh, Malacca and Penang are far more civilized than in KL and PJ. In fact, if I have to be honest with you, if you come to Malaysia, I would tell you to skip KL or PJ altogether and come straight to Ipoh or Malacca or Penang. It's a much more civilized place where, you know, I as a Baba feel safe. I can be an English-speaking Baba, and I don't get treated like a criminal for not speaking Chinese. Yes, but the point is, in today's video, we're going to talk about the Chinese ultra. The person who often comes to my channel in order to remind me that I have lost my roots, which I cut off 300 years ago. But anyway, today we're going to get into the sick and twisted mind of the Chinese ultra, and today we're going to try and explain why they turned out the way they did. And today's video is not to mock them, but to humanize them, and to understand where they came from, and how we as the Baba Nyonya people are collectively responsible, in a manner of speaking, for their predicament. Okay, let's go. Now we need to start this video with the presupposition that most Chinese Malaysians are not Chinese ultras, okay? Most Chinese Malaysians, as with other ethnic groups like the Malays, the Baba Nyonyas, the Indians, the Chettis, the Eurasians, the Orang Asli, we're all trying to survive in this brutal, dystopian, capitalist hellscape. So most people are not invested in policing people's identities, okay? So we need to be clear first and foremost that this video doesn't describe most Malaysian Chinese. And if it describes you, you'll know. As they say, makan chili rasa pedas. That means if you eat chili, you'll feel the heat. So yeah, if you're a Chinese ultra, you will know you're one. But the point is, this video does not describe the majority of Chinese Malaysians. It doesn't even describe the majority of vernacular educated people. You know, there's a myth that vernacular schools cause Chinese ultras, because I will be talking about them in this video, but rather there's a correlation between Chinese ultras and vernacular schools, but not every Chinese ultra is produced by the vernacular school system. And you know, many vernacular school graduates can turn out to be very decent and respectable human beings. In fact, Singapore doesn't have vernacular schools, and there are many Chinese ultras in Singapore as well. So we're not attacking the vernacular school system in this video, but we're going to talk about how it arose and why it arose, and why, you know, the Chinese ultras behave the way they do. So just let's get something out of the way first, that this video is not an indictment of all Chinese Malaysians. In fact, it doesn't describe most Chinese Malaysians. it describes a very particular species of Chinese Malaysian, and it probably doesn't describe you, okay? Now, Ipoh is a very quaint and beautiful and peaceful town, and it is one of the most popular tourist destinations because it's very, very tourist friendly. It's very easy to find parking if you're a domestic tourist, and it's just much more tourist friendly in many ways than places like Penang. Parking is a hellscape in Penang. It's really hard to park your car in Penang Island, but still, you know, it's a very nice place. It's very, very peaceful, genteel, polite. People tend to move at a slower pace in Ipoh, you know. So it's not as rushed and hectic as Kuala Lumpur. This is actually as peak as it gets already on a Monday morning. Now, in KL or Petaling Jaya, you would not easily find a parking spot on a Monday morning in the city center. This is the Ipoh city center, and it's, as you can see, it's very, very peaceful. It gives you a peaceful, easy feeling that you don't easily get in KL, when you feel that Kuala Lumpur is more like the hellscape in Mad Max, basically, when everything is out there to get you. You know, when I'm in KL, I feel like I'm in Elden Ring, basically. I'm thrown into a wild, hostile world and everybody's out to get me. But over here, well, or Malacca, or Penang, I feel it's peaceful. You know, you can speak English without being treated like a criminal, and you can, you know, you can walk around unapologetically Baba, and you know, nobody will side-eye you for it. PJ and KL are very, very conformist and very, very rigid societies. So yeah, as I said, if you're a tourist, do skip PJ or KL, come straight to Malacca, Ipoh or Penang. Much better, much more civilized. The hawker centers are always open very bright and early, so you know, you can easily get something to eat at every corner, and as you can see, it's not too crowded. It's very, very spacious, not claustrophobic in any way. And you know, in KL it would be so crowded at this hour, impossible to get breakfast at this hour. But in Ipoh it's very relaxed, much more so than KL. Of course, expect, you know, your food to take a while to arrive because people are not as uptight as in KL, but you know, it's much more relaxed. The pace of life here is simply much better than in KL because, you know, KL optimizes for efficiency, while Ipoh is slower and much more laid back. And in fact, I like dealing with Ipoh drivers a lot better than I do with dealing with Penang drivers, than I do dealing with KL drivers, who can be quite aggressive. Over there is the Hale Street Heritage Gallery that I visited yesterday. Now, this is a Chinese museum. Basically, it's a museum of the Chinese in Malaysia. Unfortunately, it's closed on Monday, but fortunately, I had the good fortune of visiting. Oh, well, not always. Ipoh drivers are not always genteel, but I had the good fortune of visiting yesterday. They close on Monday, but if you ever come to Ipoh, do pay this place a visit if you want to see the life of the Chinese diaspora. Now, this lady is known as Hugh Pek Ma, and she was a nyonya who lived in the early 20th century. and she has a very, very tragic story. She married this fellow, I think he was a Hakka fellow, by the name of Mr. Lee, but sadly on the way back to deliver her child in her ancestral home, she died on the bullock cart ride. The thing is, even though back then she was not married to a Baba, still, it doesn't matter. Their children would have been Peranakan because the lines hadn't yet hardened. Concubine Lane, which is basically the place where those rich Chinese fellows would keep their second wives, not even second wives, concubines. Yeah, that's your 5,000 years of Chinese civilization. Beautiful culture, isn't it? So there you have you have this lane in Ipoh, which is a very, very famous lane. And this is where those mining tycoons and wealthy Chinese merchants basically would keep their concubines or their mistresses. Very, very beautiful culture. Admirable practice, yes. Indeed. These are the houses where these invisible women lived. Of course, it's very good. It's all very good to shame me for losing touch with my 5,000 years of cruelty, but it's I personally am very, very glad that we don't have concubinage in our society today, or foot binding for that matter. So yeah, I mean, this is another really interesting spot in Ipoh you can visit. They actually have a Wagyu skewer store somewhere around here. There's a Wagyu skewer stall somewhere, but it's a beautiful place. Very, very beautiful place with a very dark history. Yeah, that's the amazing Concubine Lane, but it's early in the morning, so it gets busier in the daytime. Later in the day, really. The clinical definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and again. So, by that logic, those Chinese diaspora zealots who've been trying to get me to study Chinese through shaming, ancestral shaming, are clinically insane. Because it's been over 20 years, they've been bashing people like me for being out of touch with your Chinese heritage or lost touch with your Chinese roots, didn't make an effort to connect with your Chinese roots, whatever nonsense, even though my ancestor walked away from China 300 years ago and he never looked back. But still, I do feel kind of sorry for these people because they have an impossible job to do, to try and persuade me to learn Chinese with the only way they know how, really, through shame, through bullying, through punitive enforcement. The way they do it in the vernacular Chinese schools, I guess, because maybe shame works in your system, in your culture, but I come from an English-speaking household where there was a healthy dose of British liberalism and Socratic dialogue with my grandfather, who was educated at the Penang Free School. So, I'm not really, I'm kind of immune to shame discourse, ancestral guilt and all that nonsense because, well, frankly speaking, my grandmother was an English teacher who spoke English only to me, and she called me Sayang instead of Bao Bei. So, the Chinese language has no emotional resonance to me, really. Our conversation was all in English, and this was quite the norm in the 19th and early 20th century, in fact. Tan Cheng Lock himself spoke zero Chinese and had zero motivation to learn. But today's video is not really about me. It's why are people so bothered? Why are people in some spaces in Malaysia so bothered about people who don't share their love for Chinese civilization? We know that there is in diaspora spaces all over, in America, in Malaysia, in Singapore, and even in some parts of the UK, I imagine, banana bashing, banana shaming, basically, where people get bashed for being not Chinese enough. Apparently, a banana is somebody who's yellow on the outside, but I'm more brown rather than yellow. But the point is, the concept of white in itself is an artificial construct that came about in the 18th century by racist European scientists in order to categorize human beings. But that's another topic for another day. The point is, a banana is supposed to be a person who is a disgrace to the ancestors. You know, as if your ancestors care what language you speak, how you dress. In fact, I would imagine that most of you in your shorts and t-shirts and singlets would be regarded as a disgrace to your ancestors from 1,000 years ago. But the point is, banana shaming is basically when in diaspora spaces there is policing by East Asian diaspora people in particular towards other East Asian people. I don't count myself as East Asian, but for some reason Babas and Nyonyas always get lumped into the Chinese category. I don't know why. I don't think I'm any more Chinese than a Vietnamese person is, really. But the point is, you know, this thing seems to happen a lot, and it makes you wonder, why are people so bothered about making sure that everybody is as interested in Chinese civilization as they are? Why must they police other people? Why must they try to control the lives and choices of other people? Can't they just respect other people's personal choices in not studying Chinese, not being interested in Chinese, not being at all emotionally invested in Chinese civilization, or aka 5,000 years of cruelty, you know, because it means nothing to me? Why must people moralize about others not being interested in the things you are interested in? Like, for example, different people like different things. Let me give you an example of what I like. I like exotic pets like frogs and snakes. I used to have a reticulated python called Bitey. I released him in the Malaysian jungle. But the point is, I don't say that you are morally inferior and close-minded if you don't like snakes, right? Or frogs, for that matter. So it's hard to understand why some people would think that others are less moral and less worthy as human beings if they don't share their interest in Chinese culture or Chinese civilization, if they're indifferent. You know, indifference doesn't necessarily mean hatred. I'm indifferent to China, I'm indifferent to Chinese civilization in the same way I'm indifferent to France. I don't hate French people, I don't hate Chinese people. You know, I don't really feel any particular emotional connection to the French or Chinese as a language, or French culture or Chinese customs, or, you know, we're all products of our environment. So when most people, including foreign scholars, talk about the Chinese in Malaysia and Singapore, the presupposition is that their roots on this land date back to the late 19th century and the early 20th century, if we're talking about most Chinese descended people on this land. But what doesn't get mentioned, I should say, is the fact that there is another Creole descended group, me for instance, that has been here for well over 200 years. There is a legend, of course, that those in Malacca can trace their ancestry back all the way to the ship that brought Princess Hang Li Po to marry the Sultan of Malacca. But I think that's just wishful thinking, really, because most of our lines date back to the 1700s. Tan Cheng Lok's line dates back to 1771 when his ancestor first came to this land and married a local woman. So Penang Babas, many people don't realize this, are simply the same as their Malacca cousins, who they just migrated north, and you know, they absorbed as a result quite a lot more Thai and Hokkien influences. Now, of course, Hokkien didn't end up on my tongue because neither of my grandparents thought it important enough for the survival of our Peranakan identity, because Hokkien is like a topping for the Peranakan culture, but Malay is still the base, right? Still, the fact of the matter is that the Babas and the Nyonyas are a Chinese descended people who don't always identify as Chinese. In fact, they recently made the birth certificate amendment a possibility where you could actually get your birth certificate changed from Chinese Malaysian to Baba Nyonya. But it's quite a strict vetting process. You need documents and you need actual paperwork to prove that you're Peranakan. And to me, I don't really agree with this process, because I don't think that our lived reality should be bureaucratized. But you know, I'm not gonna stand in the way of it. I don't really need a paper stamp to know that I'm Baba. The purpose is to prevent imposters from using our name, our Peranakan name. We don't want people to be pretending to be Baba Nyonya to get cozy with the Malays, because we are known as the favorite Chinese of the Malays. Now, whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, but there is a strong concern, I think, that you know, there's great concern that some people will be imposters, they will be pretenders. But to me, I don't like this, because, or I should say I disagree with it, because there are going to be people who are only a quarter or 1/8 Peranakan, who end up without much documentation, but who also want to identify as Baba Nyonya. Now, when I photocopied Chan Kim Boon's book and I sent it to the Dewan Bahasa, Cerita dulu, the photocopy lady told me that she was in fact descended from Peranakan roots, because her grandmother was a Nyonya. But there was no way, she said, that she could actually call herself Peranakan, because she didn't inherit the heirlooms and the documentation. So there was no way she could actually prove it. So the issue that I see with the paper trail, I mean the vetting process, is that it sometimes may end up excluding people who are genuine about preserving our identity and our culture, and I am a bit concerned about that. So that's why I think that, you know, it is correct to prevent bad faith actors from injecting themselves into our culture. But also I don't think a Chinese ultra would want to actually call themselves Baba or Nyonya. You know, even Babas or Nyonyas who have adopted Chinese ultra reflexes, and there are many in Singapore, they don't identify as Baba or Nyonya. They just call themselves Chinese Singaporean, you see. So I think that worrying that Chinese ultras would want to infiltrate our space is really not something to be greatly concerned about, because if you were to ask a Chinese ultra, do you want to be Baba or Nyonya, they would be repulsed by that question, because they want to be properly Chinese, not creolized Chinese, not diluted Chinese. And yeah, you see what I mean? So to understand the origin story of the Chinese ultra, we first need to trace our investigation back to the 19th century. Now picture this. It's the mid-19th century. China is in tatters. the brutal boot heel of imperialism has been planted on her neck, and her body is carved up and ravaged by the various imperialist powers. So the Qing court, which is supposed to be the protector of the Chinese people, is plagued by corruption and inefficiency, and China is no longer in a position to protect her children. Thus begins what we know as the century of humiliation, which led us to this quagmire. Now, the difference between the Baba Nyonya and the late arrival Chinese, or as we call them, the Sin Ke, which means the new guests, now, is that our ancestors may have been poor. They may have been poor, struggling sailormen, but they did come here willingly. While on the other hand, the displacement of the Sinke, or the late arrival Chinese, was a brutal and traumatizing and involuntary movement. They never actually wanted to come here, but they had no choice, because it was either you stay in China and likely starve, or go abroad and seek greener pastures. So many Chinese people packed their bags and they went to all corners of the globe. And that's why you had suddenly a huge Chinese diaspora beginning in the mid-19th century, because of the century of humiliation, the brutal conquest, the brutal imperial conquest that basically brought China to its knees. So oftentimes when Western people complain about migrants or immigrants, you know, they say they're always coming to our countries. Why can't they stay in their own countries? Well, I like to say that the further you are, or the closer you are to the imperial core, the safer you are from its foreign policy. Or in other words, the reason why they keep going to your country is basically because you made their countries unlivable, hell on earth. So China in the 19th century was hell on earth, and people left not because they wanted to leave, but because they had to leave. But there was always a dream that they had of going back someday. So as a result, these people who left never really detached emotionally from China, and it's understandable, because the 19th and early 20th century movements were violent, traumatic and involuntary. So the Chinese late arrivals who come to places like Singapore or Malaya, they retain something of a simulated China within the land, because you have to remember that the concept of the civic state in the 19th and early 20th century didn't quite exist yet. Malaya as a civic state didn't exist until 1957. Malaysia didn't exist until 1963, and Singapore didn't exist until 1965 as a separate entity from Malaysia. I'm not going into the details of that in this video, but the point is, in the 19th and early 20th century, the concept of a civic Malaya hadn't quite been formulated yet. So basically you could, there was no obligation, there were no citizens' obligations back then, you see. So unlike the Baba Nyonya, who had an organic connection to this land, the late arrivals mostly regarded themselves as temporary sojourners who were here to make money and send remittances back to China, to their family who had been left back in China, and eventually someday return to China when things settled down. So that is how you get parallel institutions like Chinese newspapers like Nanyang Xiangpao or Sinchu Jitpo, which are basically the newspapers for the Chinese educated people, or they were more aimed for the Singkais, because by the 19th and 20th century, most Babas had become English-speaking Anglophiles, at least in the Strait settlements, such as Malacca, Singapore, and Penang. I can't really speak for Babas in places like, Kelantan or Terengganu, because those are far less documented. You should refer to Professor Teo Kok Siong's book on the Peranakan in Terengganu, if you wish. The Peranakans in Kelantan, if you wish to learn more about them. I've read some of it, but yeah, I can only speak for the Strait Settlements Peranakans, those in Malacca, Penang, or Singapore. So the Babas and the Nyonyas, by and large, were not the target demographic of newspapers like Sinchu Jitpo or Nanyang Xiangpao. They were for the Chinese diaspora, who had never quite made this land their permanent home yet, because there was hope that someday China would prosper and they could return to China. That's why many people in Penang from the Chinese diaspora gave their entire month's salary to Dr. Sun Yat-sen's revolution. And this is not something I'm going to laugh at. This is something that was done with great sincerity in their hearts, because they truly believed that China was still their home. After all, they were only here for 1 or 2 generations, perhaps 3 at most. So you can understand why China still had emotional weight for the diaspora Chinese, basically. I don't even consider Baba Nyonyas to be diaspora Chinese anymore. I think by this point we're so grafted into Nusantara that most of us don't even consider ourselves part of the diaspora, but we'll just call ourselves that in order to not create friction between us and our Chinese diaspora friends. But the point is, you see, the creation of vernacular schools, you see, was done not in order to spite the nation. There was no nation to spite in the first place, but they were made in order to prepare the Chinese late arrivals to return from their exodus. Basically, in the future, it was believed that someday China would be strong again, and as a result, it would be best that they don't lose their roots, because their real home was China, it was believed. So Quan Cheng was created in 1908, if I'm not mistaken, and it started out as a girls' school at first. They actually had a Japanese headmistress, but I'm getting besides myself. And Zhonghua was created in 1919, if I'm not mistaken. Those are the 2 most famous Chinese schools in Kuala Lumpur. And the intention of these schools really was not to create Chinese ultras. It's a very unfair thing to say that they were intended to create Chinese nationalists, but really to prepare the Chinese diaspora for their return to China someday. Because the trajectory looked like this. In the early 20th century, it really looked as if the Chinese were on their way to return to China. And the reason why the Baba Nyonyas called them Singkei was not out of cruelty, but it was assumed that someday these people will go back to their own people someday. But unfortunately, that all changed when the mid-20th century saw a very, very dramatic turn of events that nobody could have predicted. The Communist Revolution in China, in which Mao Zedong won over Chiang Kai-shek's right-wing nationalist forces, suddenly meant that overnight China would never be the same again. And suddenly, many of the people who had invested emotionally and financially in a Chinese return found that they were stuck on this land. It was a nightmarish situation, I can imagine, if I were to put myself in their shoes. Many people found themselves suddenly, very, very disappointed because the China that they knew would never be the same again, and they would never ever be able to return to China because, the communists shut the borders of China. I mean, the communists clamped down on national security, and they regarded all Chinese people living abroad as suspect, as possible reactionary infiltrators. Now, what did this mean then? It meant that the Chinese in Malaya were here to stay, whether anybody liked it or not. So what Datuk Tan Cheng Lock, the Peranakan community leader, did was he basically, with some other like-minded individuals, created this thing known as the Malayan Chinese Association. Now it's known as the MCA. Hard to imagine, but the first MCA leader was actually a man who didn't speak any Chinese, but he created this organization in order to serve the needs of the Chinese community. And basically what happened was then he told the late arrivals that it's best that you swear loyalty to Malaya, because this is going to be your home from now on. Yes, he did urge them to swear loyalty to Malaya. The sultans were very generous. They opened up the land, and as a result, the late arrival Chinese and the Indians, who found themselves homeless after the British had abandoned them, had a place to stay. You can criticize badly enacted policies that have resulted in vast inequalities of wealth and inequality of opportunity, for sure. But you can't deny the generosity of the Malays who had just come out of colonialism themselves and suffered from colonial trauma, in giving these people a home, right? But unfortunately, the China dream never quite went away, you see. And so the people who were most suited to absorbing the Chinese late arrivals and erasing the line between Baba and Singke were logically the Babas, because we had been on this land for centuries. We understood how the Malays thought, and we understood how things were done over here. And because these people were no longer going to be temporary guests, these people were going to be our neighbors and, our literal spouses. Like Penang Baba Nyonya families married in quite a lot of Hokkien women, and that's how Hokkien ended up on the tongues of most Penang Baba families. Penang Baba families married in, for example, a lot of Hokkien and Teochew women. So these people were not going to be temporary sojourners anymore. They were going to be our neighbors, our people. And we were the ones who were most suited to absorbing them. But we blinked, we panicked, because we were not sure whether this would be good for us or not. Tan Cheng Lock attempted to do that by flattening us into Malaysian Chinese, and I have a Malacca Baba friend who hates him for it, but still, most Baba Nyonyas in the 50s maintained a polite distance from the late arrival Chinese, because we had spent generations building trust with the Malays, and we also were on good terms with the British, because we were not too Malay, not too Chinese. So we didn't want the Malays or the British to get the wrong idea that we were the same as the Singke. And also I suspect it was due to the fact that we knew that they thought that we had lost our roots. And yeah, so we maintained a polite distance from them. And as a result, the Babas went their own way, and the Chinese diaspora went their own way. And that arrangement worked fairly well in the 50s, when the Chinese late arrivals were still in new villages and they were isolated from the Babas, quite literally, for the most part. But then things began to change in the late 50s and the early 60s, when, you know, the Chinese began accumulating more economic clout. They become richer and more prosperous, and they send their children to English schools, the same as the Babas. And suddenly there comes a very, very uncomfortable contradiction. Why is it that the leaders of the MCA, Tan Cheng Lock and Tan Siew Sin, who are supposed to be representing the interests of the Chinese community, are publicly defending vernacular schools, but then they themselves are sending their own children to English schools and not even considering the Chinese language or Chinese identity all that important? So that is how you saw the fact that that's how the Babas were thus muscled out of the leadership positions in the MCA, because from that point on, from the 1960s onwards, what happened is that the MCA started getting filled by the Sinke merchant classes, the Sinke merchant class, who were fast out-wealthing the Babas, were becoming richer and more dominant than the Babas, who were shrinking demographically. And because we didn't absorb the late arrivals, that's why we ended up in this situation where, you know, the late arrivals were now the majority and Babas were a minority, who were increasingly scared, by the day, increasingly afraid of dilution. So they doubled down on their insularism. And both groups, but then in Singapore, what happened was Singapore was expelled from Malaysia in 1965, right? And the Babas and the Nyonyas in Singapore were folded into the Chinese category by Lee Kuan Yew, who needed tidy boxes in order to manage a complicated state. Now, this was a very traumatizing time, because many Babas and Nyonyas who had no relevance, no emotional connection with Mandarin whatsoever, who spoke Malay at home, suddenly found themselves in Chinese classes, being bullied for not being Chinese enough by the Sinke kids, who didn't quite understand them, right? But I also think that part of the reason why the flattening had to happen from Lee Kuan Yew's perspective is because you couldn't have a group of people who were Chinese descended but very, very insular and not wanting to mix with the late arrival Chinese. Yes, in 1871, a European observer noted that the Babas are peculiar fellows. Although they hold tightly to the customs of their progenitors in all aspects besides language, they will not allow a Chinese person to enter into their space, because they fear that the Chinese person might actually start imposing Chinese expectations and bring Chinese norms and bring back a culture that we had escaped hundreds of years ago. But that made sense in the 19th century, but not anymore, because in a civic state, what has happened is that right now You can't keep excluding people, because right now what's going to happen is that if you exclude people, then they double down on their own spaces, and their own spaces may be, well, mutually incompatible with our survival. Let me explain. See, in the early 20th century, it was known, the Babas already knew that the late arrival Chinese did not particularly approve of them. And to be fair, the Babas did not really approve of the late arrival Chinese either. There's a reason why words like, you know, Sinke and China Gek exist. I don't use them, but yeah, my father told me that my ancestors used them quite liberally. Now, you had two groups that didn't quite like each other very much, suddenly having to coexist in a civic state like Singapore. That's why Lee Kuan Yew simply had to flatten the Babas and Nyonyas into the Chinese category. Because had he not done that, had he allowed them to remain a separate entity whatsoever, there might have been a lot of resentment. Basically, there might have been accusations of partiality towards the Babas, because remember, Lee Kuan Yew himself was half Peranakan. Hard to believe, right? The man who imposed Chinese on the Babas and Nyonyas, just like Lim Boon Keng, he was half Peranakan. So he couldn't appear to be partial towards the Baba and Nyonyas by exempting them from Chinese expectations. So there you go. That's how they get shoved into the Chinese box, whether they liked it or not. But funnily enough though, it made Singaporean Peranakans a lot more resilient, a lot more thick-skinned, and definitely a lot less brittle than Malaysian Peranakans in many ways. But still, you know, the fact of the matter is that, yeah, what I'm trying to say is that there was a time when we could actually have absorbed them, because when the return to China dream was no more, the Babas were in, and Nyonyas were in the most, the best position, in fact, to absorb our late arrival cousins. But we didn't do that because we were afraid. And fear, and we paid the price for our fear, like we saw in Singapore, how they were forced into the Chinese box anyway, because, you know, we didn't make an effort to absorb them. But really, in the 50s, that was when the, you know, the Babas were seen by the late arrivals as a possible model to emulate, because there was no way they were going back to China. That's why wealthy Chinese families did send their children to English schools, not to Chinese schools, because Chinese schools back then were usually underfunded, poorly resourced, and you know, they were the last place you would send your kid to unless you were planning to go back to China, or if you were very, very poor. So back then, really, most of the wealthy Chinese families tended to prefer English schools. But English schools tended to be dominated by the more affluent Babas and Nyonyas, you see. So I think what we should have done was, instead of treating them as a different category of people altogether, we should have told them, come, there's no way you're going back to China, but we're not going to abandon you. We will help you to integrate. We should have done that, but we failed. We didn't do that. And as a result, Chinese nationalism was allowed to basically expand, because we didn't offer any alternative form of dignity. So I think you all are aware of the Rex Tan fiasco, when he told George Galloway that, you know, Chinese Malaysians are like occupied Palestinians, and that was understandably nuclear. A lot of people were very, very upset, understandably, because, you know, the Chinese in seriously compare their experience with the Palestinian people. But the fact is that, you know, that was comedic hyperbole, no doubt, because, you know, the fact of the matter is that there are no military checkpoints, there are no roads where only Malay people can use. None of that exists in Malaysia. So to compare the Chinese predicament, or the Chinese state of being, the Chinese angst in Malaysia to the Palestinians, is simply a bad analogy. It's comedic hyperbole. But having said that, though, I think I can understand where Rex Tan was coming from, even though I strongly disagree with him. Because for many Chinese Malaysians, their material needs have been met. Many Chinese Malaysians, when they complain about not being accepted on this land, it's not because their material needs have not been met, but their spiritual needs have not been met. Because you will never hear a Peranakan, or very rarely will you hear a Peranakan complaining about not belonging on this land. They might complain about unfair quotas, racial quotas and all that, but they will never, ever say that they don't belong. That's a very rare thing to hear from a Peranakan. Because Babas and Nyonyas, instinctively, we know that even if not every Malay person likes us, the fact is that the vast majority of this society does accept us. However, the same cannot be said for our cousins, the other type of Chinese in Malaysia. And you know, the fact is that the Chinese in Malaysia have always felt tolerated, really, but for many of them, they've never really felt liked. And you know, when you feel tolerated but not liked, you tend to double down on your identity, and you tend to regard Chinese identity as a life raft, as oxygen. Because, you know, at least in a Chinese space where people speak your language and understand your feelings, you tend to regard that as a place where you belong. Now, I'm not excusing people who do banana bashing, or people who bash Peranakans, or people who behave in an atrocious and chauvinistic way. But I am explaining to you the source of this behavior. You know, when a Chinese ultra lashes out at me and says, for example, "You've lost your roots. You are like a skeleton living in Twilight Zone. You don't know who you are. You did not make an effort to study Chinese," blah, 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 all that nonsense. Really, I think that what's really going on in this person's head is a form of unprocessed grief. Because we never really absorbed these people into our Peranakan families. We never really gave them a chance to become Baba and Nyonya in the first place. Whether they would have taken it or not is a moot point, but because we never even gave them the option on the table, they felt that the only form of dignity, the only identity that they actually could have is Chinese, was Chinese. And when they see someone like me, for example, who's not obsessed about being Chinese enough, who doesn't even care about preserving Chinese identity, because I already moved on from that 300 years ago, and I've lived 36 years of my life perfectly happily without it. Well, what you get is some kind of an existential angst, basically. It's like, how can you be comfortable with losing Chineseness when to me I'm terrified of losing it? And that manifests itself in rage. It's the same with how, you know, you see some Asian American men who look at assimilated Asian American women and they get very, very upset, and they say those people are traitors, those people are bananas, sellouts, lose. Go on those forums like AZN Identity, right? they're mostly dominated by Asian American men who are, who feel asexualized. They feel that they are unfairly demonized. They feel that they are regarded as being asexual, backward, patriarchal, while women are indeed more accepted in American society. There's no question about that. But as a result, what happens is some Asian American men, they channel their frustration and their rage outwards at the Asian women. Now, and to be fair, there are a lot of problematic Asian women in America, and there are a lot of problematic Asian men in America as well. But they channel it outward indiscriminately at any Asian American woman they regard as whitewashed. Even if she says, for example, I'm not interested in learning Chinese, then they'll say, oh, you're a Lu, you want a white boyfriend, you don't care about Asian culture, you don't care about Asian men. But really, she's just comfortable not needing Chineseness, because Chineseness as a life raft, or Asianness as a life raft for that matter, is more needed by the men, because they see America as a hostile society in the way some Chinese Malaysians see Malaysia as a hostile society towards them. Because we all know, we've all seen the comparisons that are made. They've seen it as well, comparing them to the Babas, comparing them to the Peranakans, and the Peranakans being treated like the teacher's pet. They all know this, that the Peranakans, the Baba Nyonyas, are the favorite Chinese of the Malays. And that's because we go back a long way. We go back hundreds of years, right? But we can't realistically tell them, the late arrival Chinese, that you've got to wait another 200 years before you are as accepted as us. No, you don't do that in a civic state, because that's not going to work. We need to solve this problem right now. And the way I see it, the way I think that you can solve this problem is by erasing the line between Baba and Sinke in the first place. I don't mean forcefully assimilating them and forcing them to marry our people. That's not what I meant. And I don't mean that everybody should be called Baba and Nyonya. I don't mean that every Chinese born in this land should be called Baba and Nyonya. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that if people would like to enter our spaces or to marry into our families, we cannot regard their children as diluted. Someone who is a quarter Peranakan, 1/8 Peranakan, doesn't have very much Baba Nyonya blood, is not a diluted Peranakan. They are Peranakan nonetheless. Because right now, the Chinese are probably thinking, why should I assimilate? I'm not even going to be accepted as the Baba Nyonyas, even if I assimilate. I speak Baba Malay and I wear a kebaya or a sarong, so why should I? That's a perfectly logical thing to think. That why would you do something with no promised reward, right? So I think that the only way forward for our own survival and for their dignity as well is if we openly promote our culture and actively invite people, not Chinese ultras, anyway they won't want to join us, invite kind, gentle and reasonable Chinese diaspora people to marry into our families and to raise children with us. That's what we need to do. We cannot keep maintaining polite distance from them, especially if we are taking their money at heritage events or gentrified, overpriced Nyonya restaurants, which I never go to, by the way, because my grandmother, from my recollection, didn't make small portions, and certainly I don't see Nyonya food as some luxury good, because I am Peranakan. But yeah, what I am saying is the only way forward, I think, is not by demanding assimilation, but basically by giving people the option to assimilate. That means you need to open a door instead of saying like, oh, you know, Baba is Baba, Sinke is Sinke, and twain shall never meet. No. You know, give people the option, you know, of actually marrying into our families and making it clear that their children, if they have children with us, their children will not be diluted. Their children will not be half or quarter Peranakan, or their children will not be seen as diluted. Because if you don't do that, then there's no reason at all for the late arrival Chinese to ever consider assimilating. If there's no way they can get dignity, organic dignity on this land. Now I will probably, if you made it this far in the video, I guess I want to say thank you very much for listening. And yeah, really, when people mourn a China that doesn't exist anymore, when people start lashing out and exposing really nasty Chinese nationalist diaspora traits, oftentimes this is just a form of grief for a China that was taken away from them, you know, beyond their control. Because they know deep in their hearts that there's no going back to China. Even the China that they imagine their ancestors came from no longer exists. You can go back to China and you can see that nobody will understand dialect jokes even, because everybody now speaks Mandarin. And so China Chinese and Malaysian Chinese are like two totally different groups of people. Just like Africans in Africa and Africans in America have nothing in common besides DNA. And that's fine, that's fine. But going forward, do we want them to become local and rooted, or do we want them to stay parallel and separate? I think that's worth thinking about. So if you made it this far, thank you very much and have a wonderful day.